Welcome to Deep Transformation, Self-Society Spirit. Our co-host is John Dupuy, founder of iAwake Technologies, and I'm Roger Walsh. And with us today is someone who has been a pioneer in our helping us think through some of the many challenges around gender relations, economics, and the issues that go with our contemporary society and our relationships between men and women, and how best to foster and nurture both psychologically and economically. This is our guest is Warren Farrell, a truly remarkable man who has really been a champion of multiple gender insights and role innovations. He began, very interestingly, as a second wave feminist, and was one of the, I think is the only man who's been 3 times elected to the national board of the National Organization of Women. He's known as the intellectual father of the men's movement. He's a prolific author, starting back in the 70s with his books, The Liberated Man and The Way Men Are. And then he made a pivot towards a concern with the challenges that men were facing, and wrote The Myth of Male Power and the very important book, Why Men Earn More, which we'll get into in detail. And then more recently, he's written a very important book, The Boy Crisis. And most recently, this beautiful practical book, From Role Mate to Soulmate. So Warren is a very prolific author who has contributed to a number of areas all around gender issues. So Warren, maybe it'd be just fun to hear your personal description of your own evolution from this remarkable position of being a leader in the feminist movement to your deep concern about men and particularly boys, and now more recently looking at the man crisis. So love to hear you talk about your evolution here.
Sure. When the women's movement surfaced, for me, it just clicked immediately. I had a mother who had not gone to college, even because the scholarship was too small, and she came from a poor family, and she felt that if she had nice clothing, she'd be able to attract a man, and and that would be her security. And so she put her focus on that. But when I got into graduate school and at UCLA, she was, very happy for me, but she also started crying, and she said, I asked her what that was about, and she said, well, she told me that priority that she had made and how sad she was that she hadn't gone, taken advantage of going to college, and what the priorities were at that time. And my father had come through, he was born in 1910. So we had come at the age of 35. He'd experienced 2 world wars and a depression, and saw people kill themselves because they had, invested in the stock market and lost all their money. And he was, very fearful of spending a dollar for fear that he would, leave the family destitute if something happened. And so my mother felt like she had to ask for permission for for any time she wanted to spend something. But she was a full-time mom, because in those days you tended to be a full-time mom. But when she worked, she just, even though she worked at a very, an ordinary job, a clerical job, she felt like at least she had some independence. And I had a sister who was in high school, well, the same age as I was, a couple of years younger. And she would be often thinking about, wanting to ask a man out, but it wasn't proper in those days to ask a man out. The man, you had to, flirt and dress nicely and hope the man would notice it and ask you out. And so I thought those, things were ridiculous, that, women should, that I knew as a man that it was, I feared rejection, and it would give me days of happiness if a woman asked me out, even if I wasn't that interested, the fact that I was cared for and, attractive. And so all these things that the feminist movement was saying, and that seemed to be really very much what I wanted for my mother, for my sister, for women in general. And, I had, then I got, eventually I got married and married a woman and chose between a couple of women that I was thinking about. And the woman I ended up marrying was a woman who was very interested in, producing and being effective in the world. And she ended up being an executive vice president of American Express, and she yes, and a White House fellow. And so she was, all of this was sort of part of my inspiration about the feminist movement. And then I started when I was elected to the board of Now. They were considering rejecting men from Now, that is not allowing men to enter. And I asked why, and they said because we in those days being the 1970s, like 1960s, they were there was a consciousness raising groups would be used. Consciousness raising groups were groups where women basically got together and talked about, raised awareness of the things that they felt discriminated against, articulated those things. But men in Now, the National Organization for Women in New York City, men were oftentimes making suggestions and solving problems in these groups, and the women didn't feel comfortable being able to share their feelings freely. So the feminist leaders got together and they said they needed to kick men out of Now, but then a few of them agreed that maybe if they could get this Warren Farrell guy to form a men's group at the same time that the women formed the women's groups, that they could get the men out of the women's hair and still allow men in Now for the positive purposes that it might serve. And so they asked me to do that, and I formed a men's group. And because I was doing my doctoral dissertation on women's issues and feminism, I would sort of give like mini lectures at the men's group, and that really was extremely anti-productive. So what I ended up doing, eventually, I got myself to be emotionally intelligent enough to actually ask the men to speak up and for me to listen to them rather than to interrupt them and be the biggest jock in the sensitivity group, if you will. And so, but as I did that, my world vision changed. I saw that, I formed not only that men's group, but eventually I formed some 300 men's groups around the country and some 250 women's groups. And in that process, I started to see that man after man who once children happened for him, that he would give up his passion, like being a musician, a writer, an artist, a actor, and because these high fulfillment jobs, like even being an elementary school teacher, didn't pay very well. And so I remember one man, the first man that really struck my heart was one of the most beautiful souls I have ever seen. He was passionate about the love for his elementary school children that he taught. And you'd see tears in his eyes and his heart open up as he was talking about them. But then he had his own child, and he realized that as an elementary school, and his wife stopped working to be able to take care of the child. And together he realized they didn't have enough money to move to a location where there were better schools and a good home that they could maybe have two or three children in a good school district. And so he gave up being this elementary school teacher. He basically gave up his heart in order to be a principal. He hated administration, as most people who love children hate administration and all the politics of that. And then eventually he became a superintendent of schools. And but we in the feminist movement were saying that, look, men in education are the minority, and especially in those years, and yet they're dominating the education system as principals and superintendent of schools. Just goes to show you that men have the power. They're just power grabbers. And yet I was having the reality of seeing this man in my men's group, and this wasn't about power. This was about this was about a feeling of obligation and responsibility and living his life doing things he did not like to do so that his children would have and his wife would have opportunities that they wouldn't have if he did what he really loved to do. And so there was beginning to become some friction between my understanding of male power and male privilege and the feminist assumption that because the men were more likely to be principals or superintendents of schools, that just goes to show you that that it was about male domination and male power. And so that was some of the first little inklings of my feeling that something was that there was a good part of feminism, and then there was also sort of what I would call, as I saw feminism go from I am woman, I am strong, to I am woman, I've been wronged. I stayed with supporting that part of feminism that was in favor of I am woman, I am strong, and began to articulate different perspectives on the part of feminism that focused on I am woman, I've been wronged, and men are the problem.
Yeah, I wanted to say, Warren, I had the privilege of being a graduate assistant to Fritjof Capra in Berkeley back in the late 80s. And one of the books that was recommended was Marilyn French's Beyond Power.
Mhm.
And I read a big old fat book and I read it and I was extremely impacted. I mean, oh my God, I mean, anyway, the book changed me for the rest of my life. I've treated
Yeah.
women differently. And I'd never been I'd never had a locker talk like our president had or spoken like that or had
Right.
friends speak like that. But I became much more aware and it really helped me to, I don't know, to be a different kind of man. But I agree, then the worm turned or something's going on where masculinity, what is a positive role model for men? How is it okay to be a man? For years, I felt it wasn't okay.
Yes, yes, absolutely. And people often say to me, "Well, do you believe in toxic masculinity?" And expect me now that I've been supporting boys and men to say no. And of course, I believe in toxic I mean, I believe that there's such a thing as toxic masculinity, and I certainly believe there's such a thing as toxic femininity. That all human beings have inside of us multiple sides. But toxic masculinity is more um, part of the ethos of masculinity in this respect. Let's say we're in the armed services and and let's say we have a sergeant and he makes some, let's say, anti-Semitic comment. And the person, one of the people in the boot camp is Jewish. And he raises his hand and says, "Excuse me, officer, but I'm Jewish, and I think you made a comment that's anti-Semitic, and it really hurt my feelings." And what would the sergeant's response be? Would it be, "Oh, I'm sorry"? No. It would be, "Excuse me, isn't this sweet? Little Jew boy has his feelings hurt. Little Jew boy, why don't you do 20 push-ups?" Now, what's the purpose of the sergeant behaving so insensitively? The purpose of this preparing for war is to not be a squeaky wheel. The war machine doesn't operate when people are saying,
Yeah.
"My feelings are hurt." The war, you're preparing for war, for being disposable, for being dead, for dying, for being able to give your life for your country. And people and you're being seduced by the social bribe of people calling you a hero. And if you die for your country, you'll be called a hero, and you'll be like Uncle Joe, who's on who's on the counter in our home, and everybody worships him because he died in the Marines, and wasn't he such a hero? And I want to be a hero like that, not be criticized by my parents. So I'm willing to take all this criticism. But the result of taking all this criticism and keeping it inside of yourself is that you don't express your feelings, you don't express your fear. That creates toxicity. And so, but the toxicity is not what we feminists were saying it was about. It was not about male privilege, and it was not about male power. It was about male responsibility and the absolute opposite of male power. It was about the willingness to die and give up our lives, and not be in touch with who we are as human beings, but rather just how we can contribute to saving the world from being under the rule of Hitler. And so I was beginning to see what I felt were misinterpretation among my feminist board members about yes, there's male toxicity. Let's make sure we understand that, and let's make sure we take a careful look, which I'm really happy to do with you all today, about how we evolve for a minimum amount of male toxicity. But in the process of doing that, if you have less male toxicity, that'll be wonderful for women, but also it's going to change the role that men play in being willing to die for women and men and other people in the country so quickly.
Yeah, just want to say I was in the military. I served,
Mhm.
and I was a military policeman, and they just purposely insulted the hell out of us because
Yeah,
if you're going to be out on the street with a gun and a billy club and all this stuff, and somebody starts calling you names, you're not going to be able to, whack him on the head or pull out your pistol and shoot him. So we were aware of that. We knew that we were being insulted for a good reason, see if we could handle it. But
yeah,
there was a sense of honor, duty, country, serve, protect, all these very masculine values that I still think need to be taught. It's to be a man, it's to be in service, it's to honor the feminine, and if necessary, to protect women and children and other men, but especially women. And that's deeply embedded in my psyche, and I don't think it's wrong.
yes, and it also has trade-offs, and what we've been doing is not understanding those trade-offs.
Mm.
And so, but this really opens up a door that I think will be very helpful for women and men to understand. In my books, I talk about the commerce of masculinity being the trading of wit-covered put-downs. And so if you and I are together in the armed services and so on, I'll mock you and you'll mock me. We'll find anything, you'll find anything about me that looks a little bit different or whatever, and you'll make a joke out of it, and I'll do the same with you. And so women see this and they're really like, well, really, weirded out. The people who do this the most are the ones that are in the most hazardous jobs, the firefighters, the Marines, and so on. So most men don't understand why they do this, and most women certainly don't understand why men do this. And so here's what I think will be helpful. Men do let's say you're a firefighter, and a new firefighter comes in, and he's a graduate from Harvard, and he's the son of the fire chief. Well, you fear that he's going to be like a prima donna, so you test him out. And what's the matter with being a prima donna? What's the matter with it is that you fear that if you're in a house and the roof of one of the rooms is burning and is about to fall on you, and you're in that room, that a prima donna is unlikely to be willing to come into that room to save your life and risk his own. So you test this person out to see whether they really they're so focused on themselves and I don't want to be called this, or I'm really sensitive about that. You test that person out. And if he can handle the criticisms, you don't want to be around him. So you isolate him because you don't want him to be the one who is, if you're a Marine, he's not the one that's going to risk being killed to pick you up to save your life if you're only injured. And so these are the things that men learn to be willing to have this type of willingness to sacrifice themselves. Now, this creates some real challenges in the workplace and with HR, with human resources and relations, which is, let's say you're in the workplace, and if you and I, John, were in the workplace, and I came up to you and said, look at John, guys, he's gaining a little weight here," and I tap your belly. That would be a signal for you to sort of like, oh boy, it's beginning to show, and I have to maybe pay attention to this, and maybe you'd try to figure out a way of mocking me back. Warren, your hair is turning a little gray. It used to be, so your age is really showing, type of thing, and we'll go back and forth with each other. Now, take that, and now there's a woman in the workplace, and we go up to her and we tap her on the belly and say, "Oh, look at Marianne, she's gaining a little weight here. She wasn't like this when she first joined. I wonder what there is about us that's making her eat so much." And what would happen with that comment? It would go right to HR. and that human resources and HR would say, hey, did you really make this comment? It would probably just believe her. And then we doing that would be fired. Now here's the dilemma. So what we were doing is we were treating Marianne equally. We were doing the same with Marianne as we were with each other. And so that was equal treatment, but nobody ever communicated to Marianne that that was a sign of us showing respect for her, that she could handle it, that she could handle the wood-covered put-downs. And so what is needed in HR is what's the solution? What is needed in HR is not for HR to be about HER, which is basically her complaining to the human resources, and human resources listening predominantly or only to her, and then getting rid of the men that upset her, but rather human resources really being human and bringing in what they do. Sort of, Warren, what did you mean by doing that with Marianne? Marianne, how did that feel to you? And I say, I'm just treating Marianne like I treat John and everybody else. I want to treat her equally. I want to respect her. HR goes, Marianne, how does that feel to you? If you don't do this, Marianne, if this is not done with you, this shows a lack of respect for you. Now Marianne is looking at that very differently. On the other hand, Marianne, how did that feel? Now that you hear that, how does that feel to you? Well, I have to think about whether I want that type of treatment, of that type of equality, or I want to be able to leave that part out of my life. And maybe you can talk to me more gently about something that you care about, and not do this wood-covered put-downs, or maybe I'm going to enjoy the wood-covered put-downs and be one of the guys. So there has to be a dialogue between men and women about what types of feelings different behaviors create, rather than an assumption that a complaint by a female leads to a male being fired, or at least demoted, or at least not promoted. And so these are just some of the off-the-cuff examples of the types of misinterpretations we've done about the evolution of men and women in the last 60 or so years.
And that would require a much more careful reflection on the gender differences in communication styles than
Yes.
is the norm.
Yeah, and it seems like men need to be taught how to speak to women because they are different, believe it or not. And there are just some things you don't do. And I had a really good father and a really successful mother, and I had a really good role model growing up, but I just learned to treat women with respect. And as I learned about feminism, I treat them even more respect. And I live in the South now where, people are very, very polite. I'm Mr. John, and, but I say ma'am and sir to everybody, where it's the kid that's taking the groceries out or something like that. It's just something that's built in respectful behavior, and learn to whom you're talking. What's appropriate with your 18-year-old friend is not okay to talk to the 40-year-old man or the 25-year-old woman. There's just emotional intelligence that has to be kind of inculcated into becoming a man.
Yes, and I think the complexity here is that different women feel differently. I mean, some women would love it if once they understand the purpose of being treated equally, say, all right, fine, come on up and touch my. Now that I understand that this is an equal, sort of part of being in with the guys, that's fine. But other women would feel differently. And so what we're dealing with here is a need to communicate with each other and hear each other, and not do what President Obama did, which was he sent out a letter to all the university presidents. And he said, and the letter was what is generally called the Believe Women letter. And the Believe Women letter said to all the university presidents, if a woman on campus says that she's sexually harassed or something bothers her like that, we have to believe women. And as a result and if you don't follow that policy, your federal funds may be in jeopardy. And so that set up things on campuses where if a woman said something, instead of it going to a hearing, it would go to a hearing, but the man was not allowed to cross-examine the woman, and the man's lawyer was not allowed to cross-examine the woman. So we only heard the female part of it, and as female as victim, we didn't hear the male part of it, and many, many thousands and thousands of men that were accused of sexual harassment, and I'll get into that, what sexual harassment is and isn't, um, were discarded, gotten rid of from the college, and their on their resume, on their record, was the fact that they were let go because they were guilty of sexual harassment and so on, and that's with them for the rest of their life. And the people who were most angry about that were usually the mothers of these sons who had a more complex understanding of the types of back and forth dynamics between males and females that make what may be sexual harassment to one, not sexual harassment to another. And so the lack, so what to eliminate the opportunity for due process in exchange for just believing one was a very dangerous overreach of what a respect for women is. A respect for me, respect for women means that you give them an opportunity to be heard, but you also require of them an opportunity to hear. And so that is anything, any privilege that comes without a responsibility doesn't show respect for that person, but rather shows condescension to that person.
Yeah, and I might add that I think what you're talking about, I mean, that's true. Men do talk like that inappropriately to women, but a lot of men don't, so it's partially right and partially wrong. And I think because of the progressive wokeism, if you will, we've gotten to the point that, and I felt this personally, that if you're a man, you're wrong, okay?
Mhm.
And if you're a white man, you're doubly wrong.
Yes.
And I don't think that's fair. And I try to be the person that I would respect. And I've made mistakes, but when I do, I check in. That was a little off. Did I offend you? And they go, no, no. It's like, or if I want to say, you look really, really good today. And this is not a come on, but I just have to say you look really beautiful. Is that okay? And then you go, yeah, sure. And it's not an aggressive move. It's just expression of something that's quite self-evident for me. So
Yes.
anyway.
No, absolutely. And it's I often make comments about people's dress and so on. And when I first got together with the woman who became my wife some 31 years ago, she was a little bit sort of like, if you comment on her very nice blouse, she's going to think you're flirting with her. And we've worked that through. And I comment. I used to design my own shirts, and I enjoy art and so on. And she sees that those comments do not come with a flirtatious attitude, that what you say to somebody is the context, the tone of voice, the look in your eyes. They all speak to whether you're flirting or whether you're really just giving a person a comment. And she would fear that when I made the comment like that to men, that they would think I was gay, and and flirting with them. And so, as time went on, we worked that through.
Um, Warren, there are a lot of directions we could go here, but one of your central concerns, you have this lifelong concern with gender roles and first with feminism and then with the concern for men, but it particularly crystallized in the teens and when you really became concerned about the effects of fatherless families, the lack of a father figure in boys' lives, and you wrote the very powerful book, The Boy Crisis, I think in 2018. And that was, was actually brought to my attention. I went to visit Ken Wilber, and he read excerpts of it to me. He was enthralled in it at the time, and Ken read prodigiously, probably more than any human being on the planet. So if there was a book that really stood out to him, it was like, okay, I should pay attention to this. So that got my attention, that Ken would select this book and actually read parts of it to me. So, and yeah, this is actually, I think, marked part of your break, if that's the right word, with National Organization of Women, about your concern about the way in which fathers were kind of sidelined during divorce. But anyway, it's a complex story. Why don't you tell us about this?
If you feel these conversations can help make a difference, please subscribe, like, and leave a comment. Those simple actions really do help the algorithm recognize that thoughtful, healing, transformative conversations deserve to be shared more widely. And beyond algorithms, your engagement helps us build a community committed to truth, compassion, awakening, and the deep transformation of ourselves and the world. Also, share this with your friends and possibly even your enemies, because as Abraham Lincoln said, to destroy your enemies, make them your friends. Thank you.
Anyway, it's a complex story. Why don't you tell us about this?
Yeah, it is. And it started back when I was on the board of NOW, the National Organization for Women in New York City. And this is in the early 70s. And the divorces were just beginning to happen in much bigger numbers. And we had the first bit of research about children of divorce. And the first bit of research was showing that children of divorce that did not have father involvement, that were what I eventually came to call that were dad deprived, because people would often say fatherless children, but there's no such thing as a fatherless child. But a child can be dad deprived by having a divorce, and then oftentimes after the divorce, the children, the mother and father would live separately, and the father would have very minimal involvement for complex reasons, especially in those days, in particular, equal shared parenting was not an assumption. It was assumed that the children were better brought up by the mother. But the the early data began to show, with relatively small numbers, that the children did better, both girl and boy children, but especially boy children, when they had a significant amount of father involvement after a divorce. And so I brought this up to the board of the National Organization for Women. And remember, at this time, I was speaking all around the world on women's issues, and those speaking engagements were bringing significant income. And I was on virtually every TV show that existed at that time and talking about these issues. And so when I mentioned this, I remember to this day, decades later, the deafening silence that was on the board. And finally, one woman had the guts to speak up, and she said, Warren, you realize that we get when women who join now, they don't want us to be saying after a divorce that the child should have an equal amount of time with the mother and father. They want us to say, you make the decision, mother, as to whether you want the father involved or not. And if you've maybe if the father's been abusive, or the father's been in some way maybe potentially dangerous to the child, the mother knows that. The mother will take care of that, and she will make good decisions for good reasons. That she might want to start her life anew with a new father that might be better for the child, and maybe move out of state to some other place and start a new life. She should be allowed to do that. And if we say there should be equal shared parenting after divorce, and both mothers and fathers should be with the children, that will undermine our NOW membership, and we have a lot of fish to fry. We can't just sort of focus only on custody issues. There's pay issues and everything else. And so I said I really can understand that, and I obviously support women's right to have children and make decisions. But I also feel that when women exercise the right to have a child, at that moment they make a decision to make sure that the needs of the child are first and her desires are second. That's the decision we make when we have children. And they looked at me and said, well, you have acknowledged, Warren, that the research is just in the beginning and it's small numbers that children do better with significant dad involvement after divorce. So why don't you maybe just do some more research before you speak up on this? But know that if you do speak up to this effect of the importance of father involvement, we can't support you. We can't recommend you. And understand that a huge amount of income was coming to me and a lot of respect. And, as I said, I was on almost all the news shows and TV shows and written up in every magazine from People to Parade and stuff like that. And so, as the outstanding male feminist, et cetera. And so that was a lot to put at risk. And yet, as I did more research, the research began to show more and more that the father involvement after divorce was significant. But and as I began to articulate that, yes, I began to have less and less feminist support, and went from earning a huge amount per year and being frankly a candidate for the MacArthur Genius Grant. And when it got the room, one of the finalists knew that I was beginning to talk about boys and men's issues and the importance of fathers, and that just was enough to let them drop me from the any further interest. So I began to see it very early, this is decades ago, that if I started speaking up about boys and men, that was going to be the end of my sort of privileged position on multiple levels, or beginning to be the end. Well, I did write the book Why Men Are the Way They Are in 1986 after that. And there I was both supporting many aspects of feminism, but also saying that there are, I pointed out, I looked at Ms. Magazine, which was the feminist publication that everybody who was feminist in orientation looked at the time. And but as I looked at that magazine, I saw that every single reference to men that was made was either negative, as in your future ex-husband type of thing, or was positive if the man earned a lot of money. So there were De Beers diamond ads, for example, that would say that make sure that your man spends 2 months' salary for your De Beers for your diamond. But there was no expectation of the woman to spend 2 months' salary for something for him. But as I looked at the diamond size and I took it to people who are experts on diamonds, and they said make sure the clarity is good, and they had the 4 C's that men had to pay attention to make sure that they got a good quality diamond and a clear diamond for their future wife. And so, but in order to do that, he had to make what would be today's equivalent of a couple of $100,000 a year. And so when I did that, Ms. Magazine looked at that and they were very angry at me. And they also got a foundation to buy Ms. Magazine so that they could give up all the ads that made them feel like they had to put in comments like that. So that was when some of the tension began. When that was in 1986 with Why Men Are the Way They Are. And then when I wrote The Myth of Male Power, I just redefined what power was. I said power is not about feeling obligated to earn money that someone else spends while we die sooner. And so I sort of said, power is about the ability to have control over your own life, to be a human being, not a human doing. And I pointed out that in Japan, for example, there's a game called karoshi. And karoshi in Japanese means death from overwork or death at your desk. And the game would have little karoshi figures, and people would compete to go to the top of the ladder with each time that they won a round in karoshi. And when the person who got to the top, the player that got to the top of the ladder first, won by committing suicide, not in reality, but in the game. And so what's that about? It was the Japanese millennial understanding that what men were programmed to do was not to become human doings, not to become human beings, but to get higher and higher on the human doing ladder. And the higher they got on the human doing ladder, the less time they had for their children, the less time they had for themselves, the less fulfillment they were and oriented. And so they basically committed suicide as a human being in exchange for being a human doing. And so I began to piece these pieces together and talk about them in the myth of male power. And that, of course, brought me considerable wrath. And so those were some of the stepping stones to a book called Father and Child Reunion and a book called The Boy Crisis. And then in between there, I began to be worried about the issue of equal pay for equal work. So I did about 7, 8 years of research on exactly what were the different types of choices that men and women make in the workplace, and looked at the fact that that there were 25 different choices that men and women make, and each of those choices led to men making more money at work and women having better lives, and that if anything, men should be learning from women. And so those were some of the stepping stones to the boy crisis when I began to articulate that
and part of the I mentioned earlier is that meta narrative that came out of feminism, which I don't think it was planned on, but it just happened that man negative, bad, feminine, women good. And just like we were talking about the parents, my wife had, may she rest in peace, her mother that was not really a great mother, and she was very narcissistic and downright emotionally neglectful or abusive. And I grew up with something different. So each, as MLK said, maybe I paraphrase, but he says, I dream of the day when my grandchildren won't be judged by the color of their skin, but by the quality of their character. And it's the same thing for men and women. Just because you're a woman doesn't mean you're all feminine and sensitive and good and caring and all of this stuff. And if you're a man, doesn't mean you're brave and honest and respectful or whatever we're supposed to be. It just depends on the individual. And we have to judge each individual. And MLK, Martin Luther King, we need him more now than we ever did before. I mean, it's just like, how did we miss that?
Yes, indeed. There are many people who say that if Martin Luther King were alive today, he would be talking about the importance of the family. He would see the degree to which when children do not have fathers in their lives, they are likely to have challenges in more than 55 different areas. This is true of both boys and girls, but it is more true of boys. And so in the boy crisis, back to your question before, Roger, in the boy crisis, I articulated the data for all 55 of these areas. And in the appendix of the boy crisis, I just list them, boom, boom, boom. And so for example, when boys and girls are 9 years of age, rather, they rarely commit suicide, and they commit suicide when they do about equally. Between the ages of 10 and 14, boys are twice as likely as girls to commit suicide. Between the ages of 15 and 19, 4 times as likely. Between the ages of 20 and 25, 5 times as likely. And so so when we look at this, we see how challenging adolescence especially is for boys. And we realize we need to ask the questions like, what do we do about that? How can we change this? When men and women are 85, men who are 85 and older versus women who are 85 and older, men who are 85 and older are 1,750% as likely to commit suicide as women that same age are. And so we can, and when I mentioned this, when somebody else mentioned this actually, on a TikTok post, the response of one person on the TikTok post was their men's rates of suicide should be higher. That was sad, but was much sadder was there were 7,000 likes, people putting hearts next to that comment that men's rates of suicide should be higher. And that, John, is sort of the evolution of an attitude that has evolved in the past decades, that we have a situation of women good, men bad, and men so bad that it's actually, so it would be wonderful if the rates of suicides on the part of men would be higher. There can be, in my opinion, nothing that hurts my heart more than that.
Yeah, that's a tragic figure.
Yes.
I'm a little bit stopped by that. It's so painful that we demonize anyone,
Yeah.
any group, any group at all, stereotype any group with that amount of negativity.
Oh, I'm sorry, Roger. I was realizing I was going somewhere with that I didn't complete the circle on.
Yeah, please.
So the single biggest predictor of males committing suicide um, is a lack of father involvement after divorce. And so as I began to see that and 54 other high correlations slash causality, depending on what types of numbers were involved, that the importance of fathers on so many levels. I'll give you another example of this. At 9.5 years of age, if we the length of our telomeres, which is a part of each cell, has telomeres, and the length of our telomeres predicts our life expectancy more accurately than almost any other single thing. So boys and girls that have father involvement at the age of 9.5 are 14% more likely to have longer telomeres. Other factors being controlled for, like socioeconomic factors. However, boys who have father involvements, telomeres, are 40% likely to be even longer than girls if they have father involvement, or I think the data is the other way around, that if they don't have father involvement, 40% shorter. So it gives you a sense of how important father involvement is, even creating a type of health, internal health and external health, that allows our telomeres, that is our predictors of our life expectancy, to be either longer with father involvement or shorter without. How it affects both girls and boys, but how it affects boys more so disproportionately to girls.
So the absence of a father reaches down into the biology in very profound and enduring ways, obviously, lifelong ways. Um, and you also mapped, as you said, over 50 different areas in which the dad deprivation impacts children, and particularly boys. Could you lay out some of the psychological and social and relational impacts of not having a father around?
Yes, yes. Oftentimes after divorce, there's the divorce leads to the mother and father separating, and there's often one or more of these four must do's. I want to start out even being constructive here, and skip right to what to do. What are the four must do's after divorce that will minimize the lack of trauma for your children, both girls and boys?
Yeah, please.
And the first is an equal amount of time with mother and father, biological mom and dad. And unfortunately, it's the biological mom and dad that is the substitute, a role model, a stepfather, is not as effective. Number two is that the mom and dad, the biological mom and dad, live within about 20 minutes drive time from each other, so that the children don't feel that they angry at the parent that they have to go a long distance to because they lose their soccer practice or they can't attend their best friend's birthday party. Number three is that the children are not able to detect any bad mouthing from mom to dad or dad to mom. And bad mouthing I define more broadly as tones of voice that, so let's say you said, I have a great time at mom's last night. And dad goes, and dad just changes the subject, looks, has a stern face, changes the subject and says, how about your homework? That type of thing. And so we're giving signals to our children that talking positively about the other parent will not buy them any attention, any approval, but just switch the topic to some burden. And so that's a broader definition of bad mouthing than most people, but children respond to those cues. And number four, that the parents attend couples communication counseling or some type of couples work together, mostly counseling, at least once every 3 or 4 weeks, not just during emergencies. When it happens only during emergencies, usually during an emergency, mother and father are arguing for their perspective rather than listening to each other's perspective. The process that really helps is the listening process. So when those four things happen, then children do almost as well as they would do in an intact family without there being a divorce. But back to your question before, about to give you another example or two about what happens when there's a lack of father involvement. When there's a lack of father involvement, particularly the boy, basically starts feeling like he doesn't have one of the gifts that fathers give. One of those gifts, for example, is roughhousing. And so one would say, well, what's the big gift of roughhousing? And what we know now is that roughhousing with your children actually increases, and this is so counterintuitive, empathy. And so it's just so counterintuitive to think of roughhousing increasing empathy. And roughhousing, also done well, increases postponed gratification. So I'll give an example of this. So let's say dad here's what happens in many cases in a family. Let's say you have 3 children and dad says, okay, pops the 3 little kids on the couch and says, okay, the job here is for the 3 of you to jump on my back and try to pin me down before I pin the 3 of you down, okay? And the kids go, yeah, Dad, we'll do it right. That's fantastic. And mom's looking on and going like, oh God, I feel like I have just one more child to monitor here. And so she's really worried and she's feeling, but she doesn't want to interfere because she sees the children are really excited. And so she's sort of tries to restrain herself, but she's feeling like maybe she's quite sure that sooner or later somebody's going to get hurt. She's only about 99% likely to be right. And so so that the children hop on their back and they try to pin the children down. And sure enough, somebody sticks his or her elbow in in the sibling's eye, or something like that, and somebody gets hurt. And then mom is really going, oh my God, I wish I had, I'd stopped this process from happening. I knew it. Should have paid attention to my intuition. Now somebody got hurt and it's really my fault. But now maybe the dad will see that that somebody got hurt and will stop the roughhousing. But what does dad do? Dad says, sweetie, if you do that again, the way you put your elbow in your sister's eye like that, that'll be the end of the roughhousing. And so mom goes, well, I'm sure the kids aren't really going to get this, but all right, at least he's halfway there. And so the dad starts the roughhousing again. And this time the kids promise they'll be much better, but they aren't. They get caught up in the roughhousing and somebody else gets hurt again. And so the dad now stops the roughhousing and says, okay, there's going to be no more roughhousing until maybe later in the week. And if you do everything right, like your homework, etc., maybe we'll pick this up again or maybe not. And the kids go, oh, all right. And mom's going, wait a minute. Twice in a row, somebody got hurt and you don't get the point and you're promising them that maybe they'll do it again. And so what's happening here? The next time around, the roughhousing happens. Dad says, be careful about not hurting your brother or your sister. And the brother and the sister, this time they know that if they don't pay attention to their sister or brother's needs, fears, and feelings, that they're going to lose their treat, roughhousing. It's like a dog that knows, the puppy dog, if you do it this way, you'll get the treat. If you don't, you won't. So what's really happening here is two things. Let's look at the empathy factor and the postponed gratification factor. The empathy factor. The children are learning that if they don't pay attention to their brothers and sisters' needs and feelings, they're going to lose what they want. They're learning the beginning of postponed gratification. Postponed gratification is the single biggest predictor of success or failure in life. And so without postponed gratification, when they're asked to do homework, they do video games instead or talk to a friend on the phone instead, rather than postponing their gratification, getting the homework done, and then calling their friend after they've gotten the homework done. So what they're also learning is that they are rewarded for having an understanding of the way somebody else might feel hurt. So they're learning empathy and learning postponed gratification. But I've never heard a father, I don't blame the mothers for not knowing this, because I've never heard a father say, all this is in the Boy Crisis book, but I've never heard a father say, "Well, I read in the Boy Crisis book that that roughhousing with kids leads to empathy and postponed gratification, and we can't expect women to hear what men don't say." And so we need men to start doing their homework about what are some of the 7 major contributions that fathers make that are different from what moms make, that lead to children doing so much better when they have both dads and moms in their life, either in the form of an intact family or in the form of the not having the 4 must-dos, having the 4 must-dos that I talked about after divorce.
Warren, I'd like to say I've thought about this stuff. This is really just really good for me to be here. But I heard one time, or I thought it up or something, but when it comes to mother love and father love, then mother love, I love you unconditionally because you're my precious child, my precious baby. And the father, I love you if you do the right thing.
Yeah.
And we need both of those things inside us. We need unconditional love for ourselves, but we also need that part that, we got to show up in life and do the right thing, or, that ain't good. So when you put that together, you get a whole human being. But if you have just the one, it's very hurtful, or just the other, it becomes very narcissistic. So, we're both
Yes.
needed.
First of all, overall, I totally agree. One way I would reframe that, though, is that the father's version of unconditional love is to create conditions that will make you be more successful in life, have that postponed gratification, and have that empathy. So it's still unconditional love, but incorporated in that unconditional love is teaching you conditions that will make you more lovable to everybody else aside from us, that will make you more successful in the world. And so it's a different type of set of conditions, if you will, or it's conditions for a purpose that's still within the framework of love.
Got it. Well said.
And Warren, you said there were 7 contributions that fathers make, and you've listed some of them. Would you like to round that out for us?
Sure, I'll give another example. Teasing. Let me just take a sip of water here. The teasing is another good example that creates a lot of misunderstandings between dads and moms. So a dad will oftentimes say something like, well, let's say dessert is being sort of dished out. And so one of the kids is assigned to dish out dessert. And let's say it's cherries, and somebody and the boy looks at all the cherries and gives all the best cherries to himself, and gives a few other sort of mediocre cherries to his sister, and to the rest of the family. And so dad might say something like, well, you're really generous with the cherries for yourself, aren't you, sweetie? How about we take these cherries from you that you gave yourself, do you think you were fair to your sister and brother? Oh yeah, Dad, I was fair. Okay, well, let's just change the cherries around. We'll give the cherries that you gave to your sister to you, and vice versa. And now, the kid is feeling, all right, I've sort of been caught here. So, so the dad might make up something, some little tease like, we want you to be, cherry fair, or some other stupid pun. And the kid will, go, and so on. And so, and then maybe the dad might make some little comment, a teasing comment to the boy or the girl, and the girl or boy might sort of cry. And the mom will say, that was really insensitive that you should tease like that. And look, you made Johnny or Jane cry. And but dad's purpose in doing that is, rather than criticizing the child directly, it's the child is being teased to sort of like see if you can take this combination of humor. Basically, the teasing is like a fruit smoothie, and with lots of good minerals in the fruit smoothie, but also some bitter wheatgrass, let's say, in the fruit smoothie. And so in order for the wheatgrass to go down well, that is the criticism to go down well, the child gets the teasing or the fruit smoothie, which helps the criticism go down more easily. And so, well, the child might cry, but the child sort of gets the lesson in addition to the tears. And so if a mom is sort of like eventually really open-minded and sort of talking with the dad about, why do you do that? And dad explains, and the dad is smart enough and knows what the natural propensity for a dad to tease is, and explains it well to mom, this will really help the child, handle the criticism more effectively and be playful. So I've had moms in my workshops do this and say, well, I tried this, but one of the problems was that when I teased, the child, rather than laughing and playing with me, started crying. And I'd have to explain that from you, mom, teasing feels like criticism because the child is not expecting the teasing style, the teasing language to come from you. And when it does expect, so you have to first get the child to understand that I'm going to tease like dad does. You like the way dad sees, and you have to let your child know that you are using a different language with different intent. And so the child doesn't take the teasing from you as being criticism, whereas it took the teasing from dad as having fun with you. That's another example of one of the differences between moms and dads, and why communication is so important. As you know, when I did for the last 30 years, Roger, I've been doing the role mate to soulmate workshops. I know you held that book up before, and the role mate to soulmate workshops, those started 30 years ago when I started seeing that every John Gottman and other very good counselors for couples said one problem that they noticed was that all of us counselors for couples would say it's so important to be able to handle personal criticism without becoming defensive. Virtually everybody in the workshop would agree. But then when people got home, as soon as the first criticism appeared, that wisdom disappeared. And so that intrigued me. And I said, I wonder why that's the case. Why is criticism so hard to handle? And I realized that historically speaking, if we were criticized, it was a potential enemy. So it was functional to be defensive and to build up your defenses, in order not to be killed by the enemy. So, or alternatively, to kill the enemy before the enemy killed us. And so, but that was functional for survival, but it's just totally dysfunctional for love. So I had in my hands, could I create what was really amounted to an evolutionary shift, meaning that somebody from their partner, their loved one, could handle personal criticism without becoming defensive? Was that possible? And so for years, I worked on that. And I found that I created something that did allow that to happen. And it was called a caring and sharing practice. So before I did the caring and sharing practice, before somebody heard the criticism of their partner, they would meditate with 6 meditations that led them to be able to accept criticism and associate it not with a need to be defensive, but with an opportunity to be more deeply loved. So
Yeah.
one of those meditations, for example, was what I call the love guarantee. And so before I hear a criticism from Liz, my wife, we'll when she has something she wants to say to me, we'll set aside this caring and sharing time. And she'll, before she expresses her concern or what I would think of as her criticism, I go through these 6 meditations. And one of these meditations would be, the more I provide a secure environment for you to say whatever you want to say, in whatever tone of voice you wish to say it, the more your tone of voice is angry, and the more you say something that I completely disagree with. If nevertheless, I'm here for you to be able to articulate that and say that, and then I let you know what I heard, and I make sure that I haven't distorted anything, and I ask you if you've missed anything, and I ask you if you want to add anything more. When I do that for you, and you can say whatever you want without worrying about being interrupted, you will feel more safe with me. And if you feel more safe with me, you'll feel more loved by me. And if you feel more loved by me, you'll feel more love for me. And so that's just one of 6 meditations that I go through. And I say those meditations out loud so Liz can see that I'm preparing myself to feel completely able to not only handle anything she says, but the angrier she is and the more distorted the story is, if I'm still there with her, the more love I will feel at the end for being there for her. And so that's an example of what every couple needs to be able to do in order to be able to hear what the value of the teasing is, what the value of the roughhousing is, and the mother's perspective as to when the teasing has gone too far or when the roughhousing has gone too far. And as a result of this so the most important single thing to prevent the boy crisis is really not father involvement. That's the second most important thing. The most important thing to prevent the boy crisis is couples knowing how to communicate so effectively that they are constantly deepening their love. So there are many fewer divorces, because it's the divorces and the bad communication that leads to the divorces, that leads to the lack of father involvement, that leads to the boy crisis. So let's prevent the boy crisis at its root cause level, having stronger families with better communication, and the children experiencing role models of good communication on the part of their parents that they can then take to their peers and their children and their loved ones.
Well, during the break, I was talking with Warren, and one of the things I did when I was living in the Bay Area, I became a counselor at a detention center for young men, basically a jail for teenagers. And one of my jobs was talking to young men who were gang affiliated before they were getting ready to be released, and seeing if we could make some progress on helping to get back into the world without going back into the gang. And it's really hard. There's all kinds of pressure not to leave. And the gang affiliated kids that I worked with were all Hispanic, actually. They were Sudeños and Norteños, and the Sudeños hated the Norteños because the Sudeños had recently arrived in the United States, and the Norteños had been there for a while, so they just went at each other. So, but one of the things I noticed that in these young gangsters, if you will, is that they all came from broken families. You know, they didn't have a father figure. And I think that they were drawn into gangs largely because they wanted that masculine connection, and they were initiated. You know, you get through all this stuff, then you're part and you belong to this masculine thing. And I think that that's a big draw. And
Yes.
I know you've started hundreds of men's groups, and I was around it when I was in the Bay Area. I didn't think I needed it, but as I grew older, I saw how unwise that was and how necessary it is for men to have contact with men in order to be initiated into something that we would call positive masculinity or being a good man. We
Yes.
need each other. We need fathers. We need other men.
You're absolutely right. The data is overwhelming on this issue. You look if you that almost whenever you look at gangs, you find children who have been dad deprived. And so the process is, and I saw this, I saw this via the data, let's look at the reason for it, and then I'll give you a personal experience about that. Well, I'll give the personal experience first here. Well, I ran for governor of California some years ago, 2003, against Schwarzenegger. And so one of the things I did was to speak to prison populations. And in prison populations, I would talk with them. I would ask them, about 93% of prisoners are males. And the prison population, there's been many, many new prisons in California built, only one new university since the 1970s. And so I would look at the prisoners and I'd say, here's the importance of fathers. And I'd give the example about how many problems were solved that children didn't have by when they had father involvement. And then I would ask the prisoners, would you raise your hand if your dad was involved with you a lot when you were growing up in a positive way? And I didn't even say in a positive way. If your dad was involved with you a lot as you were growing up, and about 8 to 10%, 15%, in some prisons raised their hand that their dad was involved. All the rest,
Wow.
85%, 95 to 95%, depending on the prison. And maybe assume that a few people weren't paying attention, so give it a few more percentages than that. But we're basically talking about a dad-deprived population. And when you look at the data from people who are dad-deprived, they are far more likely to go from, especially if they go from a dad-deprived family to a male teacher-deprived elementary school. You're having the children be set up for a vacuum of positive male involvement from somebody that loves them and cares. And so they are very vulnerable to being called upon by a gang and say, hey, we can give you a family. We can give you respect. You just prove though that you can earn this by, going over and beating up Joe from the other group. And taking a beating yourself, that will show us that you're really a member of this gang. And so you have different types of negative, destructive initiatives that bond those men, those males to their quote family. And then once they're bonded to that family, it's extremely difficult to extricate yourself from that.
Very hard.
So that's one example of that. Another example of that is Hitler Youth. When Hitler Youth were looking for recruits, what they specifically looked for were dad-deprived boys, because they knew that those boys needed some sense of purpose, needed some sense of mission, needed some way of proving themselves, of having a bonding experience. So they sought those boys out, and because they were the candidates for Hitler Youth. Take a different example. If you watch the movie Spotlight, that dealt with a great deal of the molestation on the part of priests of young boys, you'll hear one of the priests saying, we kept an eye out for boys that did not have fathers because we knew that they would need us. We knew that they would want the touch, they would want the love, they would want the bonding. They would be afraid to say what they needed and they wanted, because they wanted that more than anything else. so we could take advantage of that and do that molestation. These are all three examples of the enormous vulnerability of girls and boys, but boys especially, because girls, at least growing up with single moms, have a single a same-sex role model. So when blood begins to appear and they're shocked and they can talk to their mom about, sweetie, that's your period, and that's okay. I had a period too. But the boy that's beginning to have feelings about girls and is doing something about that, like masturbating, doesn't feel comfortable going to mom and saying, I'm feeling like I want to have sex with almost every girl in my class. That's just not a conversation that most early teenage boys or boys of any age are desirous of having with their moms. And that's just one example of 100. But the things like risk taking and the willingness that dads have to have that postponed gratification, to allow for failure, and to encourage risk taking. These are things that boys without fathers don't learn. But the main thing they don't learn is 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 that it's just I don't feel loved. And the love I'd say the biggest crime, perhaps the worst thing you can do for a boy or a girl, is after a divorce for a mom to say some version of, I'm not with your dad anymore because he's irresponsible, he's a liar, he's a narcissist. And so to understand what the damage of that is the boy looks in the mirror and he sees that his nose or his hair or his eyes are a lot like his dad's eyes. And he's being told that the dad is a narcissist or irresponsible or a liar. When he when he feels that half of his genes are his dad's genes, and his dad's genes are those of a liar that's irresponsible and a narcissist, that's child abuse, because that boy is absorbing it as a form of child abuse. And I know that many people don't, they're just venting about the anger they have to their divorced spouse, but be aware that that anger has a deep impact when that person doesn't feel he can talk about what's wrong with his dad, that therefore may be wrong with him. He can't process it with his mother, because if he processes it with his mother, he loses the approval of the mother. And if he processes it with the father, he talks about it with the father, that will set up an argument between mom and dad that will make him even more insecure. So the bad mouthing issue is really crucial in that context.
And Warren, maybe speak to us of your experience of starting men's groups and women's groups. And I think I'm assuming you did this as an antidote to some of the problems that we're talking about. And anyway, tell us about that and why you started doing that and what you found in starting and leading these groups.
Well, I started that process from at the encouragement of the National Organization for Women in New York City, who said, we're going to kick men out if men don't have a men's group at the same time that women have the women's group, so we can not have the men interfere with the women's groups. And that's where I began to see how useful it was to have that. However, I also saw that it was really that when the women's groups, like when the feminist groups met for a long time, or the men's groups met for a long time without hearing from the other, both the men's groups and the women's groups began to feel like they were that the other one was part of the problem and they were the solution. So what I did is I was speaking around at about 50 universities each year. And as I did this, in order to understand the next thing I'm going to say, you have to know what a pen and a piece of paper is. In my day, we had pens and pads. And so we passed.
How quaint.
This is before the iPad. There was a yellow pad. We would pass around these yellow lined pads. And every man and woman in the room who wanted to be part of a men's group or a women's group would sign up and give their information. And then afterwards, they would come up on stage And those people, I would train them as to how to effectively run a men's group and a women's group. But one of the suggestions, almost conditions that I had, is that you meet, men meet with men and women meet with women separately for 3 months. And then you meet alternately together and separately after that. So the 3 months of meeting separately allowed you to create a feeling of comfort and a bond with the same sex. But so you don't get into the belief like many feminists have of thinking that we're right and the other one sex is wrong. You hear from the other sex after those 3 months. Every other week you meet with the other sex. And so you hear their perspectives and you go back and process that. Oh, Jim, you had all these negative things to say about your wife, but when I met your wife, she seemed lovely and she seemed very much different from what way you described her. Tell us more about that. And so that really grew the men and grew the women in a way that was much more productive than just having the men's groups or just having the women's groups.
Warren, in my preparing for this conversation today, I watched a lot of you on YouTube, and everybody should. He has a great presence on YouTube. And you gave a TEDx talk, which you did spectacularly, by the way. It's not easy to stand up there and present like you did, but there was one story that you told in there that I will take with me to the grave, I'm sure, that was very powerful and very moving. And I was wondering if you could share it with us again.
Sure, it was about, first of all, credit to my wife for encouraging me to share this in public. I had always kept this private before, but during the TEDx talk, I talked about how I was at a Ms. Magazine party. That was Ms. Magazine was the major feminist publication at that time that I wrote for. And somebody came up to me and said, "You Warren Farrell?" And I go, "Yes." And he goes, "Well, I really just want to thank you. Your group changed my life. I joined one of the men's groups that you formed, and it sort of had a huge impact on me." And I said, "Oh, that's really nice." And I said, "How so?" And he said, "Well, I am now doing something that I never thought I would do before, and that is taking care of my child full time." And I said, "So I'd love to share that with you." And I said, "Sure, yeah." So I sit down with him, we're talking. And I said, and he said, "Well, I joined this men's group that you formed, and you sort of trained them as to what would make an effective men's group. But then I heard that you're sort of like a Lone Ranger type. You just hop from one place to another and form different men's groups. So I never got to meet you. But during that time, the men's group, you asked them to go around the group and answer a question like, what's the biggest hole in your heart?" And so I sort of like rolled my eyes and I said, "Well, the biggest hole in my heart was the fact that I was so occupied with my business that that I didn't pay much attention to my wife or my son and ended up getting a divorce. And now I've remarried him, and my wife is pregnant, and we just learned that it was a son," I said to the group, that we were about to have. And so the group then asked me another Warren Farrell question, which was, "Well, what's if you could do anything you wanted, what would be your fantasy about what you'd like to do?" And he said, so I gave in and I answered that, all right, what I'd really love to do if I could do anything I want was to take maybe 5 years off my work. And so I didn't repeat the old pattern of being too busy with my work and just raise my son or full time for those 5 years. And so the group didn't let that go and pursued and said, "Well, have you checked that out with your wife?" And he said, No, it's a stupid idea, but it's a fantasy." And so the group said, "Well, maybe it's a stupid idea, maybe it isn't, but maybe the first step is to at least check with your wife and see if she would be okay with you doing that." And so I rolled my eyes and said, "Okay, I'll check with my wife before the next meeting." And at the next meeting, the group said what happened, and he said, he told me that my wife said, "Fine, John, do as you wish to do. It is, you've earned your right to do that." And so the group said, "So you're going to do that?" He goes, "No, that was just following your direction to ask my wife." He said, "I have all these legal contracts. I'll be sued up the yin yang. I have, a whole base of support that I've, developed over years. I just can't give all that up." And so the group asked me a question, Warren, and they said, John, do you own your business or does your business own you? And he said, that got to me. So I realized I've been working so hard for so many years and doing really well, but really I'm not owning the business. I maybe can do more of what I wanted to do. So I began to hear what the group was saying. I started looking into this, and that led to my actually making a decision, despite some lawsuits, etc., to take care of my son full time. I said, "Oh my God, that's fantastic. How do how is that turning out?" And was it a good decision? And I said, "How old is your son now?" And he said, he's almost 2. And so, what do you feel? Was this a good decision? He said, "No, Warren, it wasn't a good decision. It was by far the best decision of my life." He said, "I always thought about love and, sort of mentioned love, but I never had a clue as to what love was until, every bite that my son took, or every time he needed to have a jacket put on, I would help him put on the jacket." He said, "Everything I did, that was love. It was, it was focused on him, not on me, me, me." And so so this was definitely the best decision of my life. And at this time, it was, I think, 1970, early 70s, and I had just come back from my first book tour and been doing a lot of TV shows. And somebody came up to our table and said, "Can I have your autograph?" And I said, "Oh, yes, excuse me, John, just a second." And I reached up to get his autograph, to take the piece of paper and pen that he had in his hand. And he looked really embarrassed and was like, um, "What's happening here? Am I doing something wrong?" And he goes, "No, no, no, you're not doing anything wrong. Yes, I'd like your autograph, but could I have his autograph first, and then maybe your autograph afterwards?" And and I said, "Of course, yes." And so he puts, he really quickly signs his name and hands the piece of paper to the guy, and the quickness with which he signed his name and gave it to him made me realize that he must be well known enough to just have that be a natural type of thing. So I said that to him. I said, "You signed that name awfully quickly. You must be well known." And he goes, "Let's just keep it the way it was." I said, "Well, okay." But then after a little while, I said, "But do tell me," we were talking for another hour or so. I said, "Do tell me what your last name is." And he goes, "Okay, it's Lennon, John Lennon." And so I go, "Oh." And now, mind you, I'm feeling like really good about this. I said, "Oh, don't you sing with a group?" And he goes, "Yes." I said, "What's the name of the group again?" And he goes, "The Beatles." At which point, my level of ignorance, I wasn't below that. I realized, but I hadn't had a TV, or I very rarely watched TV for years. And I was so busy working on my own stuff. And so I had just barely knew that John Lennon was a member of the Beatles. And so that was a pretty stunning experience, but it was also a very informative experience about all the things that John had to do. And he talked to me later about that. He said, "I was sued left and right. And so this was not an easy process. I also had to deal with my attachment, not just my fan base's attachment to me, but my attachment to my fan base. And so my need for that type of approval and recognition and admiration. And so all of that was, stuff I had to go through. And so in the Role Mate to Soulmate book, I talk about that and all the unconscious things that I think John went through, some of which he told me, some of which I projected afterwards, that he had to do to make that type of decision to put his son, Sean, before his career.
And to add on that, I've seen a couple of conversations on YouTube between Julian, John's first son that he neglected, and Sean, the one that he took the time off to raise. And they really love each other. There's a strong brotherly bond, and there was no resentment or any of that. They're just very close, and there's a lot of love there. So,
There is a lot of love between them now, but there was
yeah.
a real period of time when, unfortunately, one of the Julian would often try to call John when he was living with Yoko, and Yoko would not pass the phone messages on to John. And there was a lot of feeling on the part of Julian's part that he was neglected, and he felt really hurt and damaged by that as well.
Yeah, he was neglected for sure.
Yes.
That really happened. Yeah.
And so there's, but one of the things that gave me even more empathy though for John was the fact that, like many times when there's this type of neglect of the child happens, John's father was also, John did not have a father that was involved, and John's father did not have a father that was involved, and John's father's father did not have a father that was involved. And so one of the things that I've learned from this experience is how intergenerational this type of thing is. And we see this so powerfully now because um, years ago, 1965, there was a Moynihan report that came out. And the Moynihan report, Daniel Moynihan he was a labor secretary and for both Republican and Democratic presidents. And he was asked to do a study of why there was so much inner city violence. And people were afraid that the study was going to result in him blaming Black people for inner city violence. But what his study came up with was that the inner city violence was not about Black people per se, but it was emanated from the 25% of Black children who grew up with dad deprived. And this was the first huge hint as to the power of dad deprivation. Now notice that my figure there was 25% at that time in 1965. In 1965, only 3.2% of Caucasian children grew up dad deprived. Today, more than 30% of Caucasian children grow up dad deprived, and more than 70% of African American children grow up dad deprived. So you get a sense that today, even among Caucasian boys, there is a dad deprivation level that exceeded that of the dad deprivation level during the Moynihan report in 1965. And so we see one of the reasons why we're having this enormous problem with our boys who, when they are dad deprived, are far more likely to not do well in school, to not have that postponed gratification. They're far less likely to have good emotional intelligence, like the empathy we talked about emanating from the roughhousing. And so these are things that lead to our boys who are dad deprived being far more likely to drop out of high school. When you drop out of high school, the chances of your being unemployed in your early 20s are more than 20%. When you're unemployed in your early 20s and you're living in your parents' basement, you're not that attractive to women. Women don't look for future fathers by searching their friends' basements and or searching through unemployment lines. They're looking for men who are gainfully employed, productive, and that have postponed gratification. So the ripple effect of not having dad deprivation is often not having a lot of love and not feeling proud of yourself, not feeling your parents are proud of you. And so not feeling that women are rejecting you, feeling angry, hurt, neglected. These are some of the things. And then, sometimes if this happens at school, almost all of your school shooters are not only male, but dad deprived males. And so these are some of the ramifications of dad deprivation.
Well, Warren, you're just painting a picture of such a vast scope here that I just want to take a moment just to highlight what you're saying, because you're saying that now we have an enormous percentage of the children growing up with multiple ramifications from being dad deprived, and pointing to the fact that the effects can ripple through generations.
Yes.
And I'm thinking of the line of Jesus, the sins of the parents, what are visited on the children of the seventh generation or something. It's
Yeah.
like you're giving an
Yes.
example of one way that can work. So this is, I mean, the implications of what you're saying are just extraordinary. And thank you for bringing attention to this. And you mentioned that one of the effects, I think as I recall, you've mapped over 50 effects of dad deprivation. One of them is a lack of success in schooling. And that brings us to another topic that you've written in a very important way about, is the gender differences in income. And your book, Why Men Earn More and What Women Can Do About This, really lays out the data. And I just want to stop and say that I really appreciate the way you have followed both your heart as to what really needs attention and the data. And that you've really looked at data on social well-being, men's well-being, women's well-being, the factors that affect that. You've really followed that, and you've really followed your heart and brought them together. And I've been very touched by our conversation. There's so much heart in what you're saying, but also grounded in real data. And so you bring to this question of differential income in men and women, an amount of information plus a precision and granularity, which is unusual. I mean, how many times have we heard the lament or the accusation that women only earn 81 cents for every dollar a man earns? And it's like the implicit assumption is it's due to discrimination of some kind. And let's just begin by acknowledging historically, there's been an awful lot of discrimination against women, particularly economic, and around the world still now. We think of Afghanistan, Saudi Arabia, there's a horrendous discrimination. But you bring to this assumption that the difference in men's and women's income in this country is just due to discrimination. What you follow through from the data is you point that there are actually a lot of factors involved, and a lot of them are lifestyle choices. So I'll throw that out as a beginning, and we can get more granular and precise, but take that way you'd like.
Yes, I started thinking about this. But first of all, my anger that, one of the early demonstrations I did was for the Women's Strike for Equality and it was opposing this unequal pay. And then I asked myself one day the question of if men are paid more for the same work as women are, why would any company hire men for whom they have to pay more than hiring women? And if they did do that, wouldn't they soon go out of business in relation to somebody who was wise enough to hire women for 76 cents as opposed to hiring men for $1? And so there was something about capitalism that built into capitalism where there was a punishment for being stupid enough to have to pay more for the same work. And we certainly and so that sort of got me buzzing. And so then I started looking at, all right, so there's what about people who own their own business? What happens there? And I found out from a Rochester Institute of Technology study that one of the things I discovered was that there was 25 different choices that men and women make in terms of both their values and their lifestyle and their desire for fulfillment versus their desire for money. That when the Rochester Institute of Technology interviewed women who own their own business and men who own their own business, they found that women who own their own business only earned 49 cents for each dollar that the men earned. And so when they looked more carefully and they said, what is your value in earning your own business? They found that women valued fulfillment. They valued safety. They valued being close to home, having shorter commutes. They valued flexibility, and they wanted to work 25 to 35 hours a week versus 45 to 50 hours a week. And so that women made the choice to have different values, like working fewer hours per week. So then I started looking into, well, what's the amount of difference of somebody working 35 hours a week versus 45 hours a week. So I found that somebody working 35 hours a week actually earns on average only half of what somebody working 45 hours a week earns. So it's only 10 hours a week more, but they earn twice as much for that extra 10 hours. And so I started looking at a lot of factors like this and realizing that the pay gap between men and women who had never been married and never had children, that the pay gap of women who have never been married and never had children versus men who have never been married and never had children was actually reversed. Women who had never been married and never had children have out-earned men who have never been married and never had children since the 1970s.
I can believe that.
And so, and the reason for that is that women who have never been married and never had children were very career focused to a much greater degree. And men who have never been married and never have children were much more fulfillment focused. And they wanted to do what they wanted to do to a great degree. They didn't have to worry about supporting a family. Now, notice this has never been married and never had children. And so so it was really like, and this was true since the 1970s, whereas even certainly in the 70s and 80s and 90s, I was talking about men discriminating against women by not allowing them to have equal pay. So this set me off in the book to do the research for the book Why Men Earn More and What Women Can Do About It, and looking at the 25 things that women can do to earn more than men do if they want to. But I also found that people who did these more fulfilling jobs that were safer, that weren't, doing construction work and risking their life on ladders or logging or doing cross-country trucking, all of which are among the 3 most hazardous jobs, that these people who did the more fulfilling jobs were more fulfilled and more happy. And so it was actually, I said at the end of the Why Men Earn More book, basically, that really what needs to happen here is that men need to learn from women, because what we all want is a happier life and women and a more fulfilling life and a safer life. And so if we want to have that type of life, we need to look at the 25 choices that women make that on average make less money, but they make less money under a specific circumstance. It's not men that earn more than women. It is fathers that earn more than mothers. Because statistically, when men and women become fathers and mothers, the woman is more likely to cut back in her work in the workplace or stop the work at the workplace. And men are more likely to do what I mentioned with the man in my men's group who was an elementary school teacher. And as soon as they had children, he quit being an elementary school teacher and he took a job he hated, being a principal of a school, but it paid more. And therefore, he did what he felt he needed to do to give his children opportunities that he wouldn't have for himself. I learned this early on in an experience with Gloria Steinem. She and I were going to a show that Alan Alda was hosting in New York, and we were riding in a taxi cab, and the taxi cab driver recognized Gloria Steinem, and he heard us talking about power and pay and stuff like that. And he said, you Gloria Steinem? And she goes, yes, and very politely, she's a lovely woman. And he goes, yeah, you're talking about all this pay stuff and men earn more than women. He says, do you, how many hours a week do you think I drive a cab? And Gloria and I go, we don't know, maybe 40. He goes, no, I drive a cab 70 hours a week. That's what it takes for me to make enough money to be able to just supply, to pay the rent for my wife and the one daughter we have. Oh, we go, that's interesting. He says, you're talking about all this power. Do you think I want to drive a cab 70 hours a week? I'm driving a cab 70 hours a week, so my daughter doesn't have to drive a cab, or a son that we may have doesn't have to drive a cab at all. I want them to not have to be where I am. And it was such a really good example of how here we were in all this theoretical academic land talking about, that earning more money is about male power and male privilege, whereas this cab driver knew exactly what driving a cab 70 hours a week and making more than his stay-at-home wife was making, was really about.
Warren, that's thank you. When I was preparing for this, again, I was YouTubing you a lot. And there's one YouTube clip. You were going on campus to speak at a university in Canada, I believe it was. And there's this group out there. They're all shouting and ban Warren, ban Warren. And it wasn't a big group, but it was a very vocal group. And I'm assuming this was kind of a woke crowd. So why do they dislike you so much? I mean, specifically, I could draw inferences from what you've been saying, but what is your impression of why these people really don't want you to speak on campus?
Yes, let's see. Interestingly, I just came back from London, where there was a documentary made on my life, that opened, about, it's called The Boy Crisis, Warren Farrell canceled. And the opening scene in this, it was me being canceled with that, with footage from that demonstration against me. And so what happened was I was being picked up to do the presentation at the University of Toronto. Instead of being picked up by a student, I'm being picked up by the police. And I'm looking at the police and say, what's this about? And they said, Warren, there's a group of feminists creating a body block, so they won't let people into the auditorium where you're speaking. And so I said, a body block? And they said, yes. And they're shouting, F you, Warren Farrell. And so
Wow.
I said, wow, that's not good. But so they said, we're picking you up to escort you to the green room, through the back of the auditorium. So nobody will have to you won't have to deal with this. So I said, well, I've only had one demonstration happen before, but with that demonstration, I gave the demonstrators free tickets to my presentation. It was just at Town Hall in New York. And I made a deal with them. And I said that you listen to my presentation, and afterwards, without interrupting it. And then afterwards, I'll ask for some questions from the audience, but then I'll come to you, and you can ask any questions you want or confront me with any misinformation or whatever you want. So I'd like to do that with this crowd. And he said, Warren, this is not that. The police said, Warren, this is not that type of crowd. They're saying, F you, Warren Farrell. I said, well, I'll go up to them and I'll say, I'd like to listen to you, but I can't give you everything you want because my wife and I are in a monogamous relationship. And I know you're saying F you, but I can't do that in a
Oh,
monogamous
how did that go over, Warren?
Well, the police said, very funny, Dr. Farrell, but this group is not, you cannot do that with this group. They are really dangerous. He said that, and the police, the campus police have called in the city police, and they're really, these feminists are giving the finger to the city police, and they're having to, they're probably eventually going to physically remove them from, preventing people from going in. So that was the opening scene to this recent documentary that's just been released, that I was over watching in London a few days ago. So
And Warren, what were the sacred cows? What are the sacred cows that you're butchering that are really making these people so hostile?
yes, I was saying things like men, it's not about men earning more money for the same work. I was saying things like, boys and men are having problems. So the advertisement for the workshop, for the speech I was doing, was on the boy crisis, even though it was before the boy crisis came out. And it was explaining what are the problems that boys are having. And from a feminist perspective, the response to this is, Warren, boys are going to become men. men have male privilege and male power. And don't you see that you're taking the small amount of resources we allocate for women, and you're wanting to take them away from women and give these scarce resources to men who already have the power and the privilege. And so that's the feminist argument against me. And so and almost every feminist would agree with that argument being against her. In fact, when I've been trying to form a White House Council on Boys and Men, and we did a proposal for that White House Council, and we presented that to we were the Boy Scouts of America officially endorsed it, and they sent an Eagle Scout and a group of Boy Scouts to meet with President Obama for the State of the Nation talk. And that they have once a year with the President of the United States, that the Boy Scouts have. And just before the talk, Valerie Jarrett, the assistant to President Obama, looked over all the budget, all the items on the agenda, and approved of all of them except the presentation to the president about the White House Council on Boys and Men. When asked why, she said it's not the time or the place. So we asked, well, what is the time? When is the place? And she said exactly what I just mentioned, that we women have only this small amount of resources, and and you want to take these away from us by talking about boys and men's issues. It's not the time and the place for as long as I'm here assisting President Obama.
So it feels it's being held as a zero-sum game, and yet it feels like your life's work is arguing and demonstrating with data that there's benefit to everyone when both men and women can flourish as fully as possible, and are provided equal access to education, to everything that makes for a full and flourishing life.
Absolutely. It's when only one sex wins, both sexes lose.
Yeah.
And you see this in colleges today. Because of the dad deprivation, well, because of the bad communication that leads to the divorces, that leads to the dad deprivation, we end up having only about a third fewer male college graduates than female college graduates. And so who's complaining about this? Women at universities are saying, I don't want to be going to a university where I have to compete with all these other women for a small number of men. And so the women are feeling that they're becoming okay with an affirmative action that gives men opportunities to go to a university so that they can have about an equal number of, at least not such a disproportionate number of men that they have to compete against a lot of women for in order to have a relationship, in order to have a family, in order to have children. So these are, and that's just an example of how when one sex loses, both sexes lose. And you know, if we love people, we're all in this together. We're all in the same family boat. We all need each other. Men and women are different, and those differences bring wonderful values when we both listen to each other and hear what the value of the other sex's differences are, and integrate the best of them. And at the same time, some men are more like women and some women are more like men. And some people, as they get older, recognize that they feel like they really were born in the wrong sex, and they should have, if they're old enough, the opportunity to be able to make a transition if they wish to. We just need to make sure that we don't allow that to happen at such a young age, where the desire might be for attention, and not really knowing fully who oneself is.
And Warren, as older men, what would you recommend that we can do personally to help boys, to help young men or people that are in the process of becoming young? What can we do individually to help overcome this huge gap in our culture?
Yeah, very important question. And so if we're a father or a grandfather, certainly be involved with your grandchildren. If you're not, and you want to make a contribution, um, and you have orientations toward being a coach, or a minister, a priest, a rabbi, these are wonderful places where role models can be provided. If you love somebody that has a female that has children and is raising them, being a stepfather. But if you're in these roles, like for example, in the Boy Crisis book, I have a significant section on stepfathers and why oftentimes, especially mothers who have daughters, do not allow the stepfathers to really be fully involved, because the orientation of a mom is more toward protecting the children, and the stepfathers might be desirous of creating more risk-taking and other things like we talked about before. And so when there's not an understanding of what a man contributes and a woman contributes, we undervalue, we don't make full use of the value of that stepfather. The other things we can get involved with is things like the Boy Scouts, and boys clubs, and we can get involved with things like the Mankind Project, helping people and organizations like the Young Men's Ultimate Weekend, or Boys to Men is another organization. So looking up people like Joe Sigurdson, who handles Boys to Men, or Mark Schillinger, who handles the Young Men's Ultimate Weekend. Um, Looking up the Mankind Project, you'll see brother the brothers, Big Sisters, Big Brothers. These are all ways that men can make significant human contributions, to being a role model for boys, expressing caring for boys, and really be helpful in the process of bringing up a generation where our boys have more emotional intelligence, more sense that they can have family by the mentor that they have rather than a gang member.
And role
Beautiful.
models, yeah.
Yes, good role
Beautiful.
models.
Yeah. And I want to just give you a chance to say more about the fact that, yes, there's clearly your push is for pro providing a mutual understanding between the sexes, and a kind of society in which both sexes can flourish. And yet there's often an assumption that if we give optimal supportive environments, that, for example, the pay gap will disappear, or that we'll have 50% of women in engineering, or and yet we have the Scandinavian countries, for example, which are the most equal on earth, where the gender gaps are larger.
Yes, yes, precisely. And so it's really important, as you know, John Gray has said in Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus. Men and women are not like this and this, but there's two bell curves, and some men are more like women and some women are more like men. But on average, as you said, in Scandinavian countries, when men are more inclined to things like entering into construction, entering into into science and engineering, and women are more inclined toward the more fulfilling occupations and the health occupations. Now, this doesn't mean we can't change this to some degree. We really do need to encourage men to be okay with being nurses, with entering into the health professions, both because that's the fastest growing industry, and also because this can bring out some wonderful parts and of men that have been not encouraged for all of history for reasons that I mentioned earlier on. And so so opening up science and engineering to women, fantastic. But expecting that it's going to be that we are discriminating if it isn't equal in all counts is a much more challenging occupation. And we have to look at our own biases. Do you want dental? So, for example, years ago, people who trained to be dental hygienists were to a much higher percentage of men. But dentists did not hire significant numbers of dental hygienists that were men because fewer men wanted a man's fingers in their mouth than wanted a woman's fingers in their mouth. Fewer women wanted men's fingers in their mouth than a woman's fingers in their mouth. So dentists stopped hiring dental hygienists who were men. That is, they overtly discriminated against male dental hygienists because of the clients discriminating against males, because so women's bodies and women's touch is much more valued by both sexes. The same thing with massage therapists. We have many more massage therapists that are women. Men have, and many usually have stronger hands, can go deeper. Many people ask for deep tissue massage, but nevertheless, there are a much smaller percentage of male massage therapists than females because more men want women and more women want women, to not completely, but to a higher percentage. And so we have to look at the differences as well as the similarities and deal with the fact that we have evolved over millions of years and that certain traits are with us. So let's work toward a type of equality, but not condemn a society that hasn't completely reached that without having a recognition of some of our evolutionary differences as well.
Yeah, and um, you've emphasized throughout again that providing situations in which everyone, including particularly women, have a freedom of choice for professions, for livelihood, the chance to live our own values and be safe economically. And you pointed out that you've just been saying that, yes, there may continue to be gender differences in income for a variety of reasons, including lifestyle choices. And we have now a potentially very disruptive political process that's going on with Project 2025, which very clearly stipulates the ideals for men and women's roles, and specifically aims to take away a variety of protections for women, such as making it harder to file discrimination suits, reducing funding, explicitly wanting to reduce funding for the social safety net, and most disastrously, reduce funding for childcare. So it seems like the political momentum in the current administration, and particularly with Project 2025, is in some ways really going to jeopardize women's economic security.
There's so many complexities with all of this. There are so many so we have to ask a larger question. So, for example, do we create a situation where there's equal amounts of paternity leaves and maternity leaves? Do we create a situation where we can subsidize parents to have children taken care of by while they are working? So that's a sort of socialist capitalist question. It's a conservative liberal question, and there's many there's so many forms of discrimination that we do for both against and for both women and men. But if we're really recognizing that the children need both parents, then we ask a bigger question. It's not so much discrimination against women. It's really how much do we want to free both men and women to enter the workplace with it being less of a sacrifice, and to what degree do we want the children to be able to have a full-time parent at home versus in a nursery school? We have to ask another deep question too, which is that we aren't talking very much about dads being home full time with the children. And that's a really valuable conversation. So two dimensions to that. One is I have a lot of women come to me and say, Warren, I'm angry that men can be have it all men. They can have a career, they can have children at home, they can be married. Women can't be have it all women. And I said, no, that's not actually true. The women can be have it all women, but in order to be have it all women, they have to select for husbands that are more inclined to be nurturer protectors, nurture connectors rather than provider protectors. So that means when women go to a party and they're looking at men instead of looking at finding out from their friends who's the future doctor, who's the future lawyer, who is the doctor, who is the lawyer, who's the executive, and moving toward them, maybe looking for men that are listening rather than talking. Maybe for looking for men who are nurturing and connecting, and then instead of waiting for them to come up to you, you going up to them. Instead of them asking for your phone number, you ask for theirs. Instead of waiting for them to call you, you call them. You will then connect with men who are more inclined to be nurturer connectors and more inclined to be full-time dads. Then you can have break glass ceilings and at the same time have a man at home who's full-time taking care of the children. And then I explained that there's one huge caveat to that. Those marriages don't work if the woman doesn't respect the man who doesn't earn money and so the woman, in order for that marriage to work, has to have one thing that she checks herself out on is respecting a man taking care of children as much as she would expect a man to respect her for taking care of children. That's the single biggest prevention from this type of equality. The next level that we have to look at is the discrimination we do have when a man and woman is pregnant. When a woman is pregnant and a man and woman are about to have children, we basically say, I remember many discussions in parties where a woman said she's pregnant, and the discussions were something like this. Do you want to work full time? Do you want to be full time with the children? Or do you want to do some combination of both? And so that would be the discussion that women would go through. But the men, the assumption oftentimes was so the woman has three choices: work full time, children full time, or some combination of both. And the man has three choices also, which is usually work full time, or work full time, or work more hours than he used to work in order to be able to do things like provide enough money for the children when the mother is working only part-time or not working at all. That's a discussion that no one has had. It's a discussion I discuss much in depth in the Boy Crisis book and in other books. If we don't have that discussion, we're going to be subject to not really giving men and women equal chances. So we'll have discussions about discrimination against women if we don't provide subsidies, but it should really be a discussion of, do we want children to have subsidies so parents can work? What are the benefits of that? What are the costs of that? Why should it be women more than men who have those subsidies? Why should it not be equally both? And so all of these are useful, productive discussions for us to have. No perfect answer, but answers that need to be part of the next generation's discussion.
Yeah, well, thank you for pointing to the complexities involved here and all these factors that need to be taken into consideration. And unfortunately, we've fallen into very compartmentalized or stereotypic positions as part of the political polarization that's going on, and these kind of deeper questions are unfortunately rarely asked.
Mhm.
Thank you very much for bringing them out.
Thank you for having the type of podcast which brings them out, allows it to be brought out and discussed. We're
Well,
very
it's a gift.
we're very fortunate to have a percentage of the population that is happy to go in depth and therefore receptive to the type of work that you and John are doing.
Yeah, well, thank you. Yeah. Um, we haven't talked about so much about your book, Role Mate to Soulmate, is there? You did bring in some of the conflict resolution, or actually how to skillfully work with feedback, and you do give a variety of practices. And is there anything else you'd like to say about that?
Yeah, a couple of things. One is that the subtitle of the Role Mate to Soulmate book is The 7 Secrets to Lifelong Love. And so one of those secrets was the creating this caring and sharing practice that I began to describe before, that has the 6 meditations that one goes through before you hear your partner's concern. And so that's a really important part of the book to look at. Another is how to create a conflict-free zone um, for the remainder of the week. So you do this caring and sharing time for a couple of hours each week. The caring and sharing time involves what I just mentioned, plus the ability to know how to appreciate each other at multiple levels of specificity. But that leaves 166 hours a week where you don't have the caring and sharing time. So how do you create a conflict-free zone during that time is another major part of the book. Another important part, which seems to be the part that I get the best feedback to, is learning how to appreciate one's partner with 5 to 7 levels of specificity. So not just saying, I like the way you cook, but saying, I really like the way you made that chicken with crispy skin and moist chicken, and the way you kept maybe on a turkey, the dressing moist, and what you use for spices. I really like that parsley, sage, rosemary, and thyme, or whatever other Simon and Garfunkel spice you notice that your wife or husband put on the turkey. So it's moving into multiple levels of specificity in your appreciation for your partner. That fills the reservoir of love and makes it therefore worthwhile for you to go through much more challenging times. How to play together. Couples that play together tend to stay together, and many couples, especially if both couples are working and they have children and they're tired, don't know they forget how to play together after a while, and how to use music as your cheapest therapist. So there's so many things in the Role Mate to Soulmate book. However, I'm going to do something I think you probably never heard an author do before. I am not going to recommend that you listen to the book on audio and on Audible. I spent a lot of time doing it on Audible. However, this is not the type of book that you can easily absorb, integrate, and change just by hearing it. You can do it a little bit better by reading it. I worked with my publisher to have a QR code in the book for an online virtual video course. That's an 8-hour practice that's similar to what I do with my workshops live, that you and your partner can use to actually go through the practice of retraining your brain to do things like hearing personal criticism without becoming defensive. You really need to practice this. When you only read it or only listen to it, you will agree with it, but it will go in one ear, and the first criticism it'll go out the other side. So I really recommend my publisher agreed to make the online course available at such a cheap price that it would cost you less to buy the book in order to get the online course through the QR code than to just get it directly.
Beautiful, and thank you very much, because it's very clear that what we're talking about here in relationship skills are skills that really require deep practice, deliberate and ongoing practice. And so the point about, yes, going through some sort of training is really appropriate. And of course, ideally, it's a lifelong training in which we train each other in relationship, but most of us could use a little help. So
Yeah, wouldn't it be great if high schools had courses like this?
I
Preparing you for lifelong relationships, preparing you to be a father or mother.
I'm trying to make two things, help make two things happen. I'm working to try to get the online couples course distributed to every poor community in the country for free, so that ministers, priests, rabbis, imams can bring it to their communities, have it be in libraries in every poor community, have it be with PTAs, and train various types of counselors to make this available where people can't afford therapists per se. And then also, so this is part of what I'm working on now to try to make this happen. But I'm also working on the Man Crisis book, so it's a lot of things that are happening simultaneously. But the best thing I can do for somebody that's listening is to say, yes, get the Role Mate to Soulmate book, but really focus on getting for $95, getting the online virtual course, and then don't just get it, use it over and over again, because your brain really needs to rewire itself to be able to do things like handle personal criticism without becoming defensive.
Yes, that is that is a major skill. And so you mentioned it, Warren, and when I sent you an email recently, I got back an automatic reply saying, it may be a while till I get back to you because I'm working on my book, The Man Crisis. So as we come to a completion, is there anything you'd like to say about what's really touching you now as you work on this book?
I think things like the suicide figure that I mentioned before, and then also how much I really have thought through the issue of how, when men suffer, how women suffer, how our parents suffer, how our children suffer, how their children suffer, and how just amazingly interrelated the crisis that anyone goes through impacts the other. When somebody commits suicide, how everybody feels guilty and grieving for years, and how and yet how amazingly important it is to recognize that we are not biologically prepared to pay attention to the needs of men in terms of feelings, in terms of fears, and men are not biologically programmed to articulate those feelings. And so as a result, we have 8 federal offices, even though women live longer in 14 out of 15 causes of death. Men experience those before women do. And yet we have 8 federal offices of women's health and 0 federal offices of men's health. And what the implications of things like that are enormous. And that's just the tip of the iceberg that I talk about in the Boy Crisis, and we'll talk about in an even more expanded way in the Man Crisis.
Well, Warren, thank you so much for all you've done and what you're doing. You've really had an extraordinary impact on our culture in so many beneficial ways. And you've not only moved with the changing cultural zeitgeist, you've actually led the way for several very important movements. And bless you for your work with the feminist movement and your work with the National Organization of Women, and for the incredible contributions you've made to men and to boys. And you're known as the intellectual father of the men's movement for a reason. And again, your many books, I just want to acknowledge. We can't run through them all. There's so many, but we've talked about, for example, the myth of the male power and why men are the way they are, and we've particularly focused on the Boy Crisis, which is very powerful. The book Why Men Earn More. I wish all the information you provide there were better known. It would dispel so many unfortunate arguments about the pay, men and women's pay. And your new book, Role Mate to Soulmate, just what could be more beautiful than having lifelong love. So, Warren, thank you so much. A deep appreciation for you. And again, just admiration for the way you've followed your heart, or as Joe Campbell said, would followed your bliss. And you've really done it with looking into the information, the data, brought that together and brought heartfelt, compelling evidence for what we as men and women and society need. So thank you very much.
Thank you. And really thank you and John and Heidi for creating this program that allows the depth to be really experienced and heard. And my wife for creating income that allows us to have a good life while I do things that sometimes don't earn as much money as they otherwise would if I did different things.
Thank you, Warren. It's been an honor and a privilege, brother. Thank you.
Thank you, John.
Well, here I am, John Dupuy again, and I'm here to talk about supporting the Deep Transformation podcast. The podcast has been an amazing experience for Roger and myself and for our team, and it's been growing. We're currently in the top 2% of worldwide podcasts, which is really remarkable. We think it's very important. We think deep transformation is the only way to go, because if we don't, we're in serious trouble. And we're so grateful for the amazing presences and spirit and soul and people who've been on our podcast. We'd also like to ask you again for your support, financial support, and thank you for all of you who have been supporting this. And up till now, it's all been out of pocket for Roger and myself. And it takes money to produce, to pay our staff, and for marketing. And so the circle keeps on growing, but the quicker that could happen, the more positive effect we could have in the world. And that's what we're here to do. And I was thinking before this, upstairs in my meditation room, I have the famous 10 Zen ox herding pictures up there. And the final one, after guys go through all this journey, is going back into the marketplace with open hands and open heart. And so that's what we're trying: open hands, open heart, open mind, so that we can do what? We can transform effectively and deeply and listen to some of the greatest minds on our planet as to how to do that. So thank you for your support. We love you and you matter. God bless.